everyone. Today I'm going to be talking to you about freelancing. The way I do my talks is I prepare my slides, I sort of practice them a bit, but I don't actually create a script. So I may go off script, or who knows, or I may forget what I'm talking about, and it'll be a disaster. So we'll see how it goes. So the title of my talk is Freelancing: How to Live the Dream and Avoid the Nightmare, which is some terms I'm going to be interrogating and looking into a bit throughout. My name is Greg Buchanan, and I'm a writer, so some of my slides and some of what I'm going to say will be slightly from the perspective of game writing, so your mileage may vary in other disciplines, but as far as possible I've tried to make it agnostic to those concerns and make it broader, drawing on several friends of mine who are in other disciplines as well to see about applicability. So first, who am I? Some of you may know who I am, some of you may not, as it just says independent next to my name, so what have I done? So this is why I'm talking about freelancing. So I've written over 20 games between 2015 to 2019, the majority of which were work for hire freelance contracts across indie, AAA, VR, mobile, like all the different types of writing and projects you could do. One of my earliest ones was a political game called Paper Brexit, which was just by myself. One of the more high profile things I've worked on was the, sorry. Cool, great. And a 30-hour story campaign for No Man's Sky, Atlas Rises. So this was like a big story that was added to the game after release and added like a huge narrative to it and several other updates. And I've also, for example, worked on additional writing support for games such as Metro Exodus quite recently. So lots of different games, and you can find out more online about my work. Before that, I've also had some background in academia. I did a PhD in identification and ethics in novels and video games. I've just been in various list type things, so like Forbes 30 under 30 this year. I was about 2 weeks off turning 30, which I now am, so snuck in, and another list. And I'm also now an author, as of quite recently as well. So my debut novel, 16 Horses, was recently bought in a deal by Macmillan, and will be published across the world in 2021, so that's very exciting as well. I'm also known, and some of you may know me for this reason, for tweeting advice about the games industry and game writing in particular. So you see my Twitter at the bottom. I tend to tweet about games things a lot. I also have a guide that I update to game writing and maybe expand to other things as well. So that's the backdrop on which I'm giving you advice. So what I will be talking about today, one thing I'll be talking about, which is probably why some of you are here, is about strategies for getting work and how to think of yourself as getting work. What's the overriding principles you follow? So I've successfully freelanced on a lot of games and made a living with that, so that's why I'm able to give that advice. Why did I choose to freelance? So I was awkward and like to be free, hence the term freelance. Now this has a kind of positive and negative aspect to it, as the talk will discuss, and as I'll go on to in a moment. I'll be talking about the dream of a freelance lifestyle. So it sounds great. You can work from home, you can travel the world and work, you can work on loads of projects, you can build a portfolio very fast. It all sounds really good. There's also some weird inverted nightmare realities of being a freelancer. So it's not great. It's actually, all those things are actually kind of terrible at the same time. And there's a kind of a bad side to a lot of stuff that sounds initially good. And I'll also talk about emotional well-being strategies. So every bad dream is manageable and is just a bad dream. And I'll also be talking about survival mode and my definition of survival mode as fits freelancers. So how you can get through kind of bad times as a freelancer and how you can keep going. So I'm going to start with this, and this is going to be linked into throughout the talk. This is my rough pitch for how I think of myself and how I try to get jobs in the industry. And I'm very happy to expand about this after, and I did a little mini Twitter thread already, which I'll retweet, about where I go into more detail than I will now about this particular point. So, beyond what I'm just put up on the thing, I'm just going to say something first. None of this will work unless you're actually able to do what you want to do. So you have to actually be able to write to become a writer. You have to be a proficient artist to get an art gig. You have to know how to code to be a programmer. So if you don't have the sufficient skills there, it may be difficult to get jobs. However, as we all know, some people are able to get jobs who may not be the absolute top of their field, but they have other assets that are able to help them, which is a useful thing to think about when you're trying to get gigs, as presumably very talented people in your own right. So I did a tweet on Twitter a while back where I said something to the effect of, if you don't talk about what you do, no one will know you're doing it. this, at its root, is not always true. We know of situations where people can be lucky enough or have networks enough that they are broadcast or they produced something so good that it's captured the hearts of many. But we also know of projects that are really good that didn't get the attention they deserved, games that were really well written or well developed that just didn't get out there as much as what you might see as more mediocre titles. There is not a direct correlation between talent and people knowing about talent, which is a key thing you have to solve as a freelancer, because you aren't selling yourself on the basis to a small number of people in a room in an interview once. You are ongoing selling yourself to loads of different projects throughout the year. So people have to know who you are in some respect. Now, I say here somehow promote yourself because there are many ways of doing this which you might be comfortable with, one more than the other. And people often claim that they don't self-promote themselves, and that's either because they've defined it very specifically or they're being disingenuous. So here are some ways in which some people might self-promote. They might have a website where they have their projects listed and some of their skills. They'll have a business card. They might attend events like this one right now, GDC. This is a networking event where you can meet people and find out new opportunities. People might have an active social media presence where you discuss things online, you join in communities, you do that. Now, some people will tweet all the time about projects they've worked on and try and spread the news. Some people will hardly ever express themselves in that kind of presence or that kind of venue, but they will in person be going to networking events or be in circles or know people that will get them work. They are doing something to be known by the people who hire, because otherwise, if you analyze it, it doesn't really, whatever the discourse is about self-promotion, it doesn't make sense that someone would hire you if they have no idea who you are. That's a causal, no relationship there. So thinking about the way in which you're comfortable doing this and the way in which you can best do this is a really important thing. And privilege will also affect this. So geographically, where you're located, certain other things about yourself may make some of these strategies more or less easy. So I would always advise never looking down on other people who do different methods to you, because they may have to, as opposed to the things you do. Beyond this, an idea which I would class under self-promotion is knowing how to hunt gigs and when to chase emails and opportunities. So knowing the venues where things are advertised or discussed within your discipline. For example, for game writing, there's a Facebook group about game writing. Jobs are routinely posted on Twitter. And loads of other disciplines as well will have different areas or different places where people discuss things, meetup groups for disciplines, and so on. Also knowing when to chase emails and opportunities. Loads of people I know who are talented miss out on gigs because they don't follow up. So they'll apply for something and they'll never hear back, and then that's the end of it for them. Whereas you shouldn't be afraid of, if you wait a polite 2 or 3 weeks after you've sent in an application, if you don't hear anything back, send a chase-up email, being polite, not harassing them or anything. And you tend to get a sense of how to do this, of being like, hi, I noticed, I was just wondering what the status of this application is. Could you tell me more? If there's anything else I can provide, let me know. This will often get you an opportunity that you might have missed otherwise, just because for game jobs, you might get 200, 300 applications, and things can get lost in the cracks. Likewise, as a way of thinking about obtaining gigs, you want to build portfolios that can be appreciated by non-specialists. Those hiring for roles, particularly in freelance, often have very little expertise in the discipline they're hiring for. This is especially true of writing, but is often the case for other things as well. They'll have some knowledge enough to discuss with you, but they won't know as much as you do. That's why they're hiring you. You're the expert who has the skill that they don't have. So by building portfolios that can be appreciated by non-specialists, you have to try and think of the mentality of those people hiring you, and you can learn this through trial and error. If you're ever in the position to help hire for a job, try and get involved, or at least sit in, because it gives you such a mindset, insight into that mindset that will alter how you then pitch yourself. So a key principle is reducing ambiguity that you will be able to do what you were being hired to do. So people often ask, like, oh, I'm an amazing writer, I'm an amazing singer, I'm an amazing voiceover artist, I'm an amazing animator, all these things. If you haven't produce many projects, there's an understandable ambiguity that you'll be able to deliver. Even if you can show the skills, they don't know if you've worked in the kind of environment that they work in. They don't know if you're reliable with deadlines. They don't know if you know the compromises required in game development to work through multiple types of project. So if you reduce that ambiguity and you're somehow able to convince people, limit risk in hiring you, that's a great thing to do, and there's quite a few different ways of doing this. For example, I advise people having a range of samples for a variety of gig types and studio sizes. So for example, in game writing, people might have, an early mistake is people have portfolios of very highly branching dense, complex, interactive fiction, people designing games that have kind of a very strange mechanic, or kind of very specific feature set, and then trying to go to like massive AAA companies with a portfolio type that is nothing like they produce. And so thinking about the kind of stuff you're applying for and having things like that is very useful. Those of you in the audience who already are freelancing or already have worked in games, because this is aimed at all levels, trying to think about how you can diversify that portfolio and work on projects different to those that might be like your dream project are really useful. And when you're early career, trying to purposefully do different types in that regard is really good. So, for example, if you want to make really kind of tragic, dramatic, emotional games, that's great, but apply for other types of games as well, especially early career. Get that diverse portfolio. Get a portfolio that makes it look like you will be trusted to do lots of different types of tasks rather than just one. And finally, and this is a very important thing, possibly more important even than pure talent, is suggesting you will be good to work with and you'll be able to work in a team. In games specifically, this is hugely important because it's often producers who hire you who are about working and establishing good team cohesion. The whole kind of like the greatest writer in the world wouldn't necessarily get a job, but a very good writer who is good to work with will get the job when that greatest writer wouldn't get that job. And being able to demonstrate that and prove that is a very useful thing to do. So obviously interviews and your communications, you'll come across a certain way with them, so not being too insistent in chasing up stuff, but chasing up stuff in a friendly manner. If you're ever asked in an interview, do you have any questions? Always have a question. It just makes it seem like you're listening more. And engaging with the material that they're discussing with you. If you have worked in any kind of team, which you should be if you're applying for jobs, so even game jams or any kind of free kind of group task like that where anyone can join, do it. Try and get some sense that you've worked in teams, communicate the kinds of teams you've worked with and the kind of roles you've worked with. As soon as you have paid work or kind of projects that have come out or student projects or whatever, try and get some testimonials from people you've worked with and put them on your website. That will be that will be incredibly useful for communicating these factors about you. And often it's also quite nice for your kind of self-care to see what nice things people have said about you as well. So those are two ways of bolstering these principles, and we can return to this later, and I'm very happy afterwards to discuss with people about their own stuff, how to further address these things. Now, I want to discuss motivations many freelancers may have for freelancing in the first place. So some people may freelance out of necessity. There may be no available in-house roles that they would rather do. They'd rather be a full-time staff member somewhere, but there's not, so they need to apply for other jobs. It may be due to layoffs. So the games industry, particularly over the last year, has experienced a lot of layoffs from a lot of big companies. People may have to freelance for short periods of time when it may not be their desired thing in order to pay rent. And others may just have gaps in the career between larger gigs that they'd rather do and want to find work in between. Some may, for example, freelance because they're early career. So a lot of game applications will say, you must have 5 years experience. So for this, it's like, how do you build that 5 years experience if you don't have any work? So you freelance is often a solution. Why I chose to freelance? Partly it's my disposition, and this may apply to some other people as well. I valued the ability to control my time and workflow as much as I could. Others are not so. Others really like kind of ongoing rigidity and kind of safety net and security of certain in-house structures, which can often really enable people's creativity and free them from a lot of worries that you might have here. Whereas I wanted other things in this regard. There were certain issues about security for me. So it's often presented that in-house jobs are more secure and safer than freelance work in terms of your earning flow. But as we've seen in the last year, and especially in different parts of the world with different laws about employment, you can often be let go at the drop of a hat. It's not as secure as it looks. Likewise, there's a sense of security that's emotional as well, for me at least, in terms of the idea that instead of one boss could have vast power over my emotional life day to day, as happens in any workplace, I'd rather distribute that and have multiple bosses, which makes me more of a force in what I can do in my own space. Likewise, there's an ambitious aspect, so I wanted to learn fast and efficiently, and make my own projects as much as possible. So if I was to be in-house at some of these studios, I would have worked for 3 or 4 years on one project, which is amazing for as an experience, but I wanted more breadth. I wanted to try lots of different things. So that's how my mind works, and that's something I value and want to do creatively, and has helped me benefit me going forward. So talking about the alleged dreams of freelancing, so pros of freelancing that people discuss. Organizational, so you might be your own boss, get to organize your own time. Insurance against mass layoffs of particular companies, so if you've got loads and loads of jobs lined up, then it doesn't matter if one contract cancels with you because you've got others. It may be very bad in the short term, but you've distributed your work time. Greater freedom from internal politics and crunch. So because you're a contractor, you have a business relationship rather than an employment relationship. You may have some kind of separation from some internal problems that a company may have. Regarding crunch, you may, for example, have a different contract kind of terms which allow you to charge for such extra time, or to contractually guard against that time. You don't have to sign those terms all the time. Finally, you might get a greater ability to promote yourself and your own work. So you might be able to talk about what you do more, or do your own projects at the same time as other ones you're working on, and actually get your name out there and what you want to do out there. No one can stop you speaking at a conference, whereas they could if you work in a company. You can remote work as well. There are also creative benefits to being a freelancer. So you work on projects you choose to work on, rather than those your company assigns to you. You might have freedom to create your own solo work and IP in multiple mediums. So a lot of games companies, as some of you may know, for full-time roles, do not allow you to work on any projects outside of the one they ask you to, even in different media. So, for example, as a writer, if I wanted to write a novel working for some of these companies, I wouldn't be allowed to, unless they gave me permission. Otherwise, they'd own it, which didn't sit right with me as an industry norm. Likewise, as I mentioned before, learning and developing skills much faster due to working on a range of projects in different types, studios, and genres. Now, as I said at the beginning, there's a sort of a bad side to a lot of these things as well, which must be considered carefully if you were to make the proactive choice to become a freelancer or stay a freelancer. A lot of people will present it as very positive in a career, and it does have its positive aspects, but you have to accept, due to the nature of the world we live in, that there are various consequences of some of these things. So for be your own boss, that sounds great in one respect, but you also have all the anxieties, worries, and lack of security that come to that. You're your own boss, yay. You're also your own boss with all the, you may treat yourself like a boss would treat you, which is a strange relationship to have with your own work, and you can be very hard on yourself as a freelancer in a way you wouldn't be if you were an employee. Likewise, organizing your own time, that sounds great. And have any of you ever tried to do massive projects in your spare time? It's very difficult to organize your own time with no one's making you do things at particular opportunities. You have to have a lot of self-discipline. You have to be able to get back on the horse at certain times. Insurance gets mass layoffs, so yeah, fine, but it's often way easier to terminate contracts than employment in many cases. So you can there is some level of security, but you have to be very careful who you work with. You may sometimes get paid late, sometimes you may not get paid at all, and might have battles with companies going on behind the scenes. Due to NDAs, you may not even be able to say that you haven't been paid, which is a really weird scenario to be in. Likewise, you may have greater freedom from internal politics, but you may actually be more vulnerable to this than others, and you may be seen as an outsider. So yeah, fine, you're free from that day-to-day situation in the studio, but there are sort of certain familial benefits you often get in teams where people hang out with each other all the time. If you're not there, you might, for example, be excluded from meetings. People in the studio might resent the fact that you're being given all this stuff to do when they want to do it, and so on. And you might have kind of various conflicts that are just totally not in any way your responsibility, but can arise. Likewise, yeah, fine, you can often promote yourself, but non-disclosure agreements are very constant throughout the industry, and you may never be able to talk about certain projects to the extent that you'd like to, and even when a project comes out, often NDAs will last in an indefinite amount of time, so you have to ask permission to talk about it. Finally, you may have an ability to remote work, but sometimes no, you don't. You have to go in-house. So there are loads of jobs which would require you to move across the country or the world for 5 months with no promise of employment beyond that. When you do remote work, there have to be a whole host of other potential issues about movement of time, about wanting you to check in non-stop on an online messaging service, for example, when you're actually working on other stuff. Time can be a strange thing, and companies don't always know how to deal with that process. On the creative side, working projects you choose to work on, yes, but often the process to get on a project can be very strange. So in writing, there's a common thing where you might have like a 6-month-long selection procedure that's kind of Kafkaesque, and you might be kind of selected or not selected for various kind of indeterminate reasons that you're never really given feedback on. If you have the financial luxury to wait for perfect projects, yeah, fine, you can work on projects you choose to. But if you need those contracts every month for different jobs, you'll often just have to take things as they come and convince yourself and others that you're the best person for that project. And yeah, sure, you'll do a great job, but is it the one you really set out to do when you wanted this freelance life? Not necessarily. Likewise, yeah, fine, you've got freedom to create your own work, but time and energy can be a huge issue of actually being able to do that when you're working on contracts all the time. However, I would argue that this isn't really as much of a nightmare as it sounds, because you're still free to do so ultimately, which for many people they will value that you can make something because you want to make it, and you're not told by a corporate entity that you cannot. On the final point, I actually don't think there is a weird nightmare side to that. I think you do learn and develop skills faster in some ways. They're not necessarily the same skills you'd learn if you were on a project for multiple years, but you can learn a lot if you leverage the opportunities correctly and rapidly diversify, see multiple studio types, styles of working, genres of game very quickly. Cool. So overall, there is no dream, as the title of the talk suggested. You always wake up. You always move past those positive aspects. But likewise, there doesn't have to be a nightmare. It doesn't have to be as bad as those bad things sound. You can find something in between, which is what partly I'm advising today. So be mindful of your emotions and energy levels, mitigate inevitable psychological threats, and prepare for challenges. So it's a hard life being a freelancer. It's very rewarding, but it's hard, and not everyone wants to or is suited to doing it, but may have to. So hence the advice today. So 2 such major psychological threats, which actually link into the advice about careers in general that I was discussing at the beginning. You may suffer imposter syndrome. So many of you in this room may suffer from imposter syndrome and wonder about your own skills. It's a common thing. You have to constantly pitch your own work and abilities to gain new gigs, maintain current relationships. You're often isolated from teams and colleagues. That kind of friendship throughout the day or that kind of camaraderie you may lack. You may not have anyone telling you you're good because you've been hired to do a task, and if you do it, then that's often paid. That's often seen as you being told that you're good. No one may ever tell you that your work was good until you find out in a review that it was good, which could be a very strange life. You don't have performance reviews or anything. Likewise, you may not be able to discuss your own work. So certain sources of pleasure that you'd normally have about talking about what you do, you don't always have. You're not in control of, even after release. You may often also face the threat of burnout. So the unpaid labor of self-promotion, tests, applying for work, economic fear can take a toll on a lot of people. You have the excitement of all these different things, but the associated costs and risk of what if I don't get a gig in the next few months? What if I have a period of unemployment? What if I have to borrow money? What if I get into debt? These can all be huge issues that are emotionally exhausting in addition to the work you're doing. Likewise, being pushed to meet aggressive schedules and manage multiple projects can also be a bit of a toll. So it's great you get to work on loads of stuff, but you're working on loads of stuff, which can be a kind of quite a big problem in itself and create an emotional toll. So some strategies for dealing with these things if you embark on this career. So client dealings will often add to your sense of imposter syndrome. So having to convince people, not getting the kind of feedback you might want, weird internal politics, and all the other issues I've discussed can add to it. So you want to make sure the situations you get involved in are as good as possible and setting expectations. Often companies aren't intentionally acting in a way that's detrimental to you. So consider interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. Assess, try and get, even if you're going to take the job, whatever, because you want the job and you need the money, you can still stand up for yourself in the interview process and try and make sure that the working environment's the right fit. So set expectations about your schedule, your hours, your involvement in the team, your role, your working habits, how you work. Tell them how you've worked on other projects. That's a great thing to do in an interview because, once again, that whole idea of ambiguity about whether you can do it, that answers that topic, but it also helps you in terms of your working time. It sets up, that's how I'm going to do it. You know this is hiring me. And you can refer back to that if there are problems later, like you knew that I work like this, and how you get feedback. It's often good to have an arranged feedback cycle so that you actually get some affirmation on your work. Gain contractual protections regarding crediting and post-release discussion. So always ask for in your contract that you are definitely credited, and make that a compulsory thing about working with them. Likewise, have some kind of protection that may allow you to in some way discuss your work post-release. And I can post some extra stuff about this online afterwards about how I formulated this, so I'll post that on Twitter later. This is more of a strange thing, but kind of schedule your worrying about things to particular times in the week, and I'm going to discuss in a second, like career time, planning time. Don't just be in a constant fear mode about arranging stuff. Make that part of your job. Book that in like you would something in a job for a particular time. Curate your site for self-care. So websites are great for advertising yourself. They're also great for advertising yourself to yourself. Reading about your achievements, seeing what you've done, editing that and keeping that going. It's really, I find that fun. So I can just edit it for the sake of it. I'm not doing anything. I'm just making it nicely arranged and looking good. Find communities, join in with other people, talk with other people, make sure you're not alone. Likewise with burnout, manage your time. Easier said than done. Schedule and quarantine a block of career time daily and weekly, even if contract. So even if you're in jobs, spend maybe like half an hour a morning or an hour a week or whatever trying to build those self-promotional strategies, look for talks to apply to, look for game jams to go to, look for communities to join, look for new projects, even if you've got stuff arranged. Never stop. If you stop, that's where more risk can be created for yourself. Try and reduce the cognitive load of too many tasks by finishing short ones first, which is generally a good idea to try not to be doing too many things. And there's a principle I call soft and absolute rest time because I'm very unhealthy in my own working habits. This is just what I kind of try and do. But soft rest time is where I'll say, in ideal conditions, I will relax here. So, absolute rest time is in non-ideal conditions. I will still rest. I will still have this rest break no matter what, unless it's really bad and I have to. Sure. So for example, soft rest time, I might take the evenings off during the week and a Saturday and a Sunday if things are going good. In absolute crisis conditions where I have to burn out, I even then will not take Sundays, I'll take Sundays off. I will make sure I take that rest. It's extremely important. Try and have someone you trust hold you accountable and encourage you with this. Make sure they know your schedule and make sure they keep you to it. I'm just quite going quickly at the end because I've got a bit of time. So dealing with career gaps, follow previous advice and self-promotion. If you've got a gap between gigs and you're really hunting for stuff, extend those blocks to longer periods of time, the career blocks. So devote more time to things. So one thing, for example, I'll do on Twitter when I'm in these gaps is I will search for certain keywords like game writing, game writers, narrative designers, so on. That will take ages to trawl through. Most of the tweets are totally irrelevant, but I will find a gig maybe once a week or something like that. Loads of people aren't willing to do that, but that will actually deliver me from crisis. That will actually give me jobs no one else has found when I have to. And being willing to do that is something you have to as a freelancer. Reach out to your professional network directly for support, always a good idea. Other people will then actually possibly give you projects or make you aware of things if you have to. Also work on a project of your own, even if you don't have work. Your work is your business, which can include your own solo projects and your own creative endeavors. So keep going even if you don't have paid employment. Consider a side hustle if necessary. Various times throughout my game career, I've, for example, tutored or did teaching briefly to be able to make rent and so on. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Not everyone can be constant and things will happen. Exiting survival mode, so being able to move out of that can be really difficult. Once you've had a few periods of time with big cancellations or things you've had to move past, it can be quite hard to get back to normality. So one thing I'll do, for example, and you can define this on your own basis, is if I have less than 2 months of work arranged, I will then hit the mode I just described, where I try and find work and I do all those things, and that gives me a bit of a safety net from absolute crisis. Exiting survivor mode can be really difficult, so writing a commitment and putting that somewhere of when you'll feel safe is a really good idea. And get an accountability partner to help pull you out of this when you reach this point. So try and get someone who will be able to recognize and be around you enough to recognize when you need to move on and let go, because it can be very dangerous otherwise. And finally, make sure you try and finish the solo project, but don't be unkind to yourself, because keep going, do your own stuff. That's why you're a freelancer, you can do this. So in sum up, be kind to others in your position. We're all in this together, and a lot of freelancers may try and build each other up or cut each other down. Those who build others up will often be helped far more than those who cut others down. Others will help you, others will recognize your goodness and your willingness to support. Be just as kind to yourself. We often are very hard on ourselves in a way others are not, and as freelancers, we're very much at risk of this. You will create your best work when you're inspired, not when tired, miserable, resenting creative activity. You may draw on those emotions to produce work later that you've had in other times, but when actually creating, that disturbs no one, so don't drive yourself into the ground. So that's the end, exactly at time, but I'll be available for questions afterwards and around the area and stuff, so yeah.